Hello and welcome back to another episode of Second Player Press Start. My name is James and I'm joined with my buddy
Darren. That's me.
And we're here today to talk about God of War.
Yes.
Darren played about an hour of the beginning, and he had only seen a trailer, which may sound kind of crazy to a lot of you, but the only thing he saw was a trailer, and that was it.
Truth.
I've played through maybe 3-ish hours, and I wanted to kind of get Darren's take on what he thought, and I'll kind of chime in with some of my thoughts.
Sure.
Just within this first hour. So if you haven't played it, obviously there'll be some spoilers ahead, because the game does start off with a bit of a bang, and I'll let you kind of kick things off.
Sure. So, speaking of just seeing a trailer, that's been kind of the way of things in the last few games that we've talked through. Through A Way Out and Detroit, I've only seen trailers for those games, and then we dove right in. And that gives me only enough of a vision or version of the game to have some preconceived ideas about expectations, but not much more than that. And I think we chose deliberately, when we looked at the trailer, to look at the cinematic trailer or the story trailer?
I think it was
versus
the story trailer,
the gameplay trailer. So that set me up for kind of an expectation about how narrative the game would be. I think from the opening sequence, when you press start, the screen that you're looking at, you're kind of looking at Kratos, like maybe waist up at this tree. And as soon as you start a new game, that vision is still the same, that shot is still the same, and it goes right into the gameplay. There's no opening title, opening credits, anything like that. And it just jumps right in. He's at the tree, and then there's this kind of solemn moment where you see this handprint on the tree, and he kneels down, and there's this moment of like remorse and sadness, I guess, as much as you can read off this character. And this character being Kratos from the God of War series from over a decade ago, maybe the first one was. I don't remember when the first one came out.
Yeah, I think it's, probably maybe 10 plus years. Kratos has been a very one-note character.
Sure.
And he appears that way at the beginning of this game, but...
Right, it's just that the note is different than what we've seen him before. This guy has aged. I haven't played a lot of the God of War stuff before this, but the expectation of a brawler, like a third-person brawler, feels, when you open this sequence with this character standing at this tree and bending down on one knee, and just having this like moment of sadness, and already it is setting you up for breaking the expectation of what you think God of War is or means, or who this character is. And the first bit of interactivity is when you swing your axe to hack this tree down, that you already have come to realize is important to this character. I thought that was just a brilliant opening sequence. I thought that was really effective to give that interactive moment where you're forced to, because there's no other interaction available, but you're forced to cut this tree down and you're the one swinging the axe. I thought that was really effective. It opened it up in a really compelling way. It grabbed my attention right off the bat. And from that point forward, I'm interested, okay, well, what does this tree mean? And whose handprint is that? And now he picks up the tree and he starts walking with it. And then there's this kid there. And so right off the start, there's so many questions that I'm interested in exploring about this character. And I found that a really interesting way to begin that sequence.
I don't know if you clued in, but the game is actually just one long continuous shot.
Yeah, I mean, because of some of the action sequences, it was hard for me to notice that in terms of what I'm looking at now, because there's so many things on the screen at various points, and some of the fight sequences, in the way you get just knocked into the air and stuff, there's different aspects that it's hard to tell how much of it is just that one train shot on the one character, but I can see that. Yeah, just kind of thinking back through it. How did you feel about that? Like, it did feel cinematic, and it felt like almost a documentary style film, right? Where you're just watching this character go through the motions.
I think that's the one thing that's impressed me most about this game. I did learn before I played it, which I was kind of bummed about, that the whole game is actually one continuous shot. Like, there's no fade to black, there's no like the cutscene between cutscenes and gameplay. There's no pauses, there's no loading screens. It's just one seamless shot, and we're impressed when they pull that off in cinema. I think there was a scene in Children of Men, I think.
Yeah.
There was one long continuous shot, and I remember how people were kind of losing their minds about that scene. And I think as a game that can pull this off, there's no, like, it just keeps you wanting to play more, because there's no room to stop. Like, it just keeps propelling you forward.
Sure, yeah. There's some natural breaking points in the narrative. In fact, when I stopped playing, I had finished fighting with the stranger, and I go back to the house to find my son Atreus and move on with our journey, which moments before that, Kratos says, "You're not ready. You're just going to stay here," and that's that. But as soon as we step out to the door, we look at the mountain, and there's a flash of the kind of the metagame title screen on the next chapter.
Yeah.
That was like, okay, this is a good place. We can stop and chat about the experience thus far. So yeah, that's a good point. I thought about Children of Men when you talked about continuous shot, and I know even in cinema, a sequence like that takes a long time to set up. Running it on an engine like this, the one game that comes to mind is Half-Life, and how Valve is very specific about they don't fade to cut scenes or anything like that. Everything is done within the viewpoint of your Gordon Freeman character. And that sets you up for feeling like you are the character, at least in the Half-Life games, because it's a first person. And what's different about this is we see the Kratos character on screen, and because of the way you can manipulate the camera and the way they do the cutscenes, even though they don't cut, is you still see his face and things like that, which you don't see that in the Gordon Freeman character. It's all from his viewpoint. So
first
characters
person,
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, I think, like, visually, the music, the presentation, like it's pretty near flawless. Like, I think they knocked it out the park in terms of, like, this is, like, top level game development, like AAA, like, this is why I kind of love Sony and their first party is games like this, like Last of Us.
That's a game I was going to reference in particular.
Yeah.
Last of Us.
Which, yeah, I mean, there's a very Last of Us vibe with kind of your main character with the child kind of following you along this journey. And it's another thing that I think I really like about this game is, Kratos may be this kind of very one-dimensional character, but the contrast of his character between him and his son, there's just an interesting dynamic between them. And the first little sequence when you're kind of hunting a deer was just a really well done piece of storytelling. You learn a lot about Kratos and about his son just in that little kind of brief storyline.
Right.
There's the son's struggle to finish killing this deer that they're hunting. And then there's a scene just shortly after that where the son's upset that he killed this deer, and Kratos kind of raises his hand to almost comfort him, but then kind of pulls his hand away.
Right.
Kind of showing that there is a vulnerability to this guy that, you know, we thought was this one-dimensional character.
Absolutely. Yeah, I was definitely going to bring that up too, because we both have kids. We both have sons in particular.
For sure.
In particular. And just the idea of the choices that we make and the actions we choose or choose not to act out with our sons or in the view, and how we perform masculinity. And this, I hope that the game talks about that kind of thing. Like, what does it mean to be a guy? What does it mean to be a man? What does masculinity look like? Can you be vulnerable? Can Kratos afford to comfort his son and still be Kratos? I think those are some really compelling questions. And to see a AAA title ask those questions is interesting to me. There's a lot that I'm interested in continuing for that story and that character development. And I hope that they deliver on that we get more from God of War now than we ever did in the past.
Yeah, I think there's they can take that very far. I mean, does Kratos kind of soften, and then does his son become more like him, and maybe he sees that, like, maybe it's a reflection of himself.
Sure.
That he maybe doesn't like. I don't know.
Right.
But there's, the setup of this game, I just thought it was fantastic.
Yeah, there's a lot of ripe opportunity for storytelling between the setup that we've got already within an hour. And there's also the fact that the narrative is pushing the mechanical tutorial forward. So it was very rarely that there was something that I wanted to do in the world that I wasn't just about to learn or had just learned how to do. There wasn't really, wouldn't necessarily say there was a puzzle sequence or anything like that. The closest was when I had to lift a gate and then find a way to stop the gate from falling when I let go of the chain. But the fact that the HUD shows up how to throw your axe at that point means that, okay, I'm going to try that. I don't know exactly what to aim at this point, but you know, there's a glowing thing kind of in the world that I'm going to try to hit.
Yeah.
Right. So there's elements like that where without being very explicit about what you had to do in terms of a sequence, if you knew what buttons to have, it was okay for you to kind of play and figure it out on your own, because there wasn't a risk of having to restart or anything like that. And I think that I felt the same throughout the entirety of the sequence that I played. I didn't feel at any point that I was going to lose or get a game over screen or anything like that. And
to be fair, though, you were playing on baby mode.
I did play on no, it wasn't Nightmare. What was it called again?
I think it was like the easy show me the story kind of thing.
That's right. The sequence we talked about when we played through Detroit about the different options at the start of the game for difficulty level. And this one kind of gave some idea of what the differences would be, but it wasn't in any practical sense. There's the story mode where you just want to experience the story. Then there was the kind of the medium challenge where you want some challenge in combat. And then there was the ones over and above that where, again, it was mostly focused on how difficult you wanted the combat sequences. I think in a game that plays this fine line between cinema narrative and combat sequences, that works. At this point in the game, other than going into the menu sequence for the first time, which just I totally was not prepared for, and I'll chat about that in a second, but I know that there's more, like there's a bigger world to explore in this game, and the fact that there is even divergent paths to explore in that opening sequence, even though the sequence itself narratively was very linear, I know that there's a bigger aspect to this game, and that possibly the game has these open world elements that we see in so many AAA titles these days. But from what I played, I didn't really get to make those kinds of decisions. I felt in some points that my interactivity almost felt a bit random. Like I chopped the tree at the very beginning, that's the first time, and then I have to interact to pick up the tree. And then I walk all the way to the boat, and when I get to the dock, I hit the button again, and then he goes through a whole sequence again. And then I move the boat, and then when I dock the boat on the other side, I interact again. And then there's another long sequence of me watching. And I felt like there were some of those moments where if I'm already invested in the cinema of it, I don't need to interact with it just to open a door to make me feel like I'm playing a game. And at other times, maybe giving over the controls or giving over some of those movements. There was a time after I fought the stranger, and Kratos' movements, his animated movements for walking were much slower, and he just got the hell beaten out of him, right?
Yeah.
So whereas in some games, the harder you press on the control stick, the faster you move. In this game, that was all pre-scripted, so it didn't matter if I was lightly touching it or pushing the control stick hard, he would move the same way. And so I was still in control of the character, but the sequence was built to reflect a certain state of that character and the way it was animated. And I feel like there's other moments in the game where I probably could have interacted with it, but they chose to just do the whole thing cinematically. I'm not sure how you felt about that. I could go either way, either give me more interactivity or give me less. But I felt at some points I was like, why are they making me get to this point in a visual sequence that I have no control over, and then make me open a door? Those kinds of things never make sense to me.
Yeah, I think it's tough too because you only have the context of that first hour.
Sure.
Which is very much just kind of setting things up. And you are right. Like, you did pause the game briefly and saw that menu screen, which is pretty overwhelming.
Right.
Because it hasn't introduced any of those
That's right.
Mechanics or systems to you at this point in the game. And I actually did the same thing on my first playthrough. I think I paused it for some reason. I'm like, whoa, okay, there's a leveling system, and there's there's upgrades, and
the way that I stumbled upon it was they showed a button sequence on the screen that to hold up or hold down on the D-pad to look at your journal or something, because I had found a new character in the world, and going into the journal alerted me to this whole menu sequence, right, that I wouldn't have seen unless maybe I paused it otherwise. But what was interesting about that, the reason there was such a contrast was because the HUD at that point in the game was so minimal already. There was the little green bar in the bottom, a few little outlines of bars that hadn't even been established to me as a player yet. I don't know what any of these things do. Eventually I learned that there's this kind of rage meter thing, right? But that was right at the end of this hour-long sequence. So up to that point, when I first got into the menu, the HUD was so minimal. I've been looking at the world and the character pretty much in its entirety the whole time up to that point. So to move into that sequence, because the game said hold up on this to do this thing, meant that it shifted my immersion considerably. And that break from one visual to the other visual is just such a contrast. I think that I feel like if they didn't force you to open the menu or tell you on the screen to open the menu to look at this journal entry, there was a better way that that could have been introduced. Because I feel like the pacing for the sequence I played, I was not interested in exploring the menu at all at that point in the game. And I could have explored it at another part in the game where it felt more natural. So to me, it just felt like an immersion breaking point and a pacing breaking moment, where if I took any more time looking through that than I did, I could have been there for probably another 10 minutes, like digging around for no reason in the narrative. And I think that could have been handled differently, for a better pacing experience.
Yeah, because, I did the exact same thing. Yeah, and it was when you interact or when you first encounter a creature, it adds it to this kind of, I don't know what the word is, but this...
Codex
of, or this index of characters or enemies that you're fighting. And it's written from your son's perspective, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah, I thought that was neat too.
But that's exactly how it happens. I brought up the index to read a bit about the creature, and then there's all this other stuff around it. And then if you tab over, you're presented with this information that hasn't really been explained to you, and it is very jarring. And it could have just been a simple matter of disabling that part of the system UI that until you got to the part where it starts to introduce that, then it's kind of revealed.
Yeah, I think because in the HUD itself, like I said, even though there was other elements that they were showing me on the screen, like what the play HUD, right? Not the menu sequence or the menu information and that kind of thing. But some of that was already disabled, right? Until I learned about health, there wasn't a health bar on the screen. Once I learned about health, there still wasn't a rage bar, but that came up later. And once I learned about Arcturus's arrows, then it showed a little arrow icon and numbers for arrows. And that was all sequentially done out, so I didn't have to learn about everything at once. And I felt that pedagogy, I don't know how to pronounce that word, but that sequencing of learning was really important to me feeling like I was focused on the narrative, not focused on all this meta information that I have to now make decisions about. And they could have easily done the same thing so that there's no way to see anything else but this journal entry. And you read it and it's still within the lore of the game because it's written from a first-person perspective of the son that is recording the journey he has with his dad, which is a fantastic way, I think, to look at that as a lore, as a piece of lore, as a piece of fiction in the game, and then go right back to the sequence. If you're the kind of person that reads through it, there's a pause moment where you read about the character from the perspective of the kid. And if you're not the kind of person that wants to read this kind of content, then you skip back and things keep going. There's not even a moment where you could get into this rabbit hole of menu information and upgrading or whatever those things are that I don't even know at this point, you know?
Right.
So I think that's a really good point, that even just shutting those elements off, just make the tabs not appear, just like the rage meter doesn't appear until later.
Yeah.
For sure.
In the grand scheme, it's a pretty little minor oversight. What did you think? God of War has always been traditionally kind of a beat 'em up game. What did you think of the combat?
So I was challenged because not only am I coming into this God of War, knowing what the other God of War was as a brawler, right? But my experience with any kind of fighting game or brawling game is that I'm using the face buttons to do actions, right? In a first-person shooter, I use the triggers to shoot and aim and that kind of thing, right? Like iron sights and cover and all that kind of thing. And, but in a third-person game where I see my character on the screen and I'm hitting things, my expectation is not to use the triggers. So there's a number of times, and I think I get used to it over time, there's a number of times where I wanted to, duck out of the way or move to the left or hit somebody, and I was hitting the wrong buttons and nothing was happening. And that was a really challenging hurdle for me in the midst of the most action that the game saw. So I felt like I don't know what to expect going forward, and I don't know why they did the buttons the way they did. And there's probably a reason for it, I'm sure, because these folks aren't dumb. Like, there's some really good stuff here. So I can't imagine that the people who worked on this game that's presented the way it is so far are just like, oh, what the hell with the controller? I don't even care. Just map buttons wherever, because it doesn't matter. I think there's a reason they did it.
Yeah.
But my expectation was that was one of the hardest things for me that felt really out of place. And that's just because of the expectation I have for brawlers and fighters, and then coming to this game just kind of threw that out.
I completely agree with you. I struggled in the beginning too, because these games typically use the face buttons to do attacks, right? Like from Devil May Cry to God of War. It's just the way it's always been. I had a really hard time using those top two trigger buttons to attack, and I thought, why are they doing this? Like, it seemed really weird. But then I would say it was probably around the second hour, it just kind of clicked. And I think the reason they did it, which, because I've thought about this before, is having your fingers resting on those four buttons, you can do that. Whereas if it was mapped to the face buttons, you're typically, you would have to shift your finger kind of
from your
control stick to one of those buttons.
Right.
So I think, and I got the sense of, oh, this is why they did it, kind of within that second hour as the combat kind of clicked. Because as I'm maneuvering, I'm blocking, I'm throwing my axe, once it clicked, it kind of made sense. And I kind of let go of that old way of doing it. Like you said, they probably thought about this. And I think there is an option to revert to having it mapped to the face buttons, but from what I've played, by that second hour, the way I was kind of maneuvering and parrying and blocking and attacking, and I felt way more in control than just kind of mashing X or triangle like the old games used to be.
Right. Yeah. And I can see that. I mean, part of the idea of feeling like you have control in a combat sequence of your character is, we talked almost about the opposite of that in Detroit, how you felt like some of the controls didn't respond as well as you wanted them to, as well as you expected them to, even though you weren't in a sequence that was as high action, as high energy, as high inputs per second or inputs per minute or whatever the stat is, right? But in this game, because your interaction frequency is higher, you want there to be fluidity, and you want there to be you want to minimize the amount of button movements you need to do. Like, if you need to move, like you say, your thumb from your control stick, you need to line up your shot and then move your thumb over to hit the button. I can see that. Whereas, say, in a fighting game, you're not really using your right stick that much. In this game, that's your aiming orientation. Your camera. So you move your character with the left stick and you aim with your right stick. And that definitely would have an effect, which is why even in a first person game, because you're aiming with that right stick, to shoot with the X button or the circle button or whatever isn't going to be natural. Because you might lose your aim shot, especially in like higher Twitch games, right?
Yeah.
You're going to lose your aim before you even get a chance to take the shot.
Yeah. It didn't click, but then when it did, it's like, oh, okay, this makes complete sense.
Right. How did you feel about, because you've played more of the God of War games than I have, and there's probably in some of what's going on here references to previous characters. He talked about Faye, I think, which I assume is his wife's name, the way that he was talking. But I don't know, maybe I caught that name and I pronounced it wrong or something. But maybe she's in previous games. Maybe like Cortana and Master Chief, she's like somebody that follows through the game with Kratos, because I haven't played a lot of the old games. So how do you feel the progression of the narrative and those characters? How necessary is it to know that? How much does it add to your experience of the game?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've played every single God of War game, but the reason I went to those games wasn't because of the story. I have never finished a God of War game. I've got close, but for whatever reason, maybe it's just my nature of, the games that I, truly fall in love with I'll finish, but
Sure.
Even games that I like, I'll get, 3/4 through, but something new and shiny comes along, then I'm kind of on to the next game.
Right.
But I've enjoyed my time with the old games, but those games were pretty shallow, and there was a story there, but it was never like I couldn't really tell you any past characters of note. It was a pretty thin level of story to tie these combat sequences together.
Sure.
And I think this game does a good job of, there are subtle hints to those past games, but it's not really necessary. Like, I'm sure you could read a Wikipedia article and kind of be caught up in 5 minutes. I don't think there's a deep God of War lore sitting out there. But I think the game's self-contained enough that you get a sense of, okay, Kratos was away from his son, and it looks like the mother was raising the son. And now, because the mother has passed away, Kratos is now kind of stepping in her shoes to continue to raise the son, and there's something special about this kid, but we don't really know that yet. There's something they're alluding to him being sick, or the son was mentioning, I haven't been sick in a while. I'm not too sure what that means at this point. And that's the way you tell a good story, is you drop these subtle hints, and you can reveal it over time.
Sure.
And I don't think there's anything in the previous games that really need to be, at least, from what I've read and heard, it doesn't seem like it's that important.
Right. Because coming from the previous games, we have, to my experience, from my memory, we're dealing with Greek and Roman mythological creatures, gods, right? And in that way, we're also in that place. So, the Mediterranean and the Middle East and sand and desert. So to see Kratos cut this tree down and there's snow around in the first opening, automatically, I know this is a guy in a totally different place now. And that's even the way we see him visually, the big beard, and he's an older guy, there's gray in his beard, everything is in a different place and a different kind of feel to it. And I wonder if that was this necessary positioning of this story. Maybe it could be, as long as it was different enough, then there was a way to make it about God of War, but realize from the very opening that this is totally different. And I think, to me, that set me up for success. Maybe somebody else who was way more into God of War than you were felt let down by that. We're not killing Zeus anymore, kind of thing. But I don't know. I think that was a a breath of fresh air, I guess is a way to say it. One of the things that I guess I was challenged with is I felt some things were a little anachronistic. Like, we're in a time and place in the sequence where we're still hunting deer with bow and arrow, right? And there's all these trolls and there's all these creatures that make me feel like not only is this a fantasy world, but whatever fantasy world it is, it's not technologically advanced, right? So it's not science fiction fantasy. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
Which means that when the kid says stuff like duh, and like there's certain elements about the way the kid is presented that feel more contemporary than the setting leads me to believe. And I'm not sure if that's just some elements of the writing. And to be fair, there hasn't been so much dialogue that has done that I feel like it was a misstep by any means. But those things that I did notice that felt out of time make me wonder how much of that continues into the game at large, whether there's another 20 hours or 50. Like, I don't know how big this game is. So, but that's something that I noticed just because spending so much time in the world and with these characters, to have those moments, again, just like that, moving into the menu screen, just took me out of the sequence of it.
Right. Yeah, I think it's a fine line because, that there was a moment where his son, I think you were wandering off in a different direction, and the son said, like, kind of sarcastically, like, you're supposed to go this way, Dad, duh. Like, right. Which seems, on one hand, it seems out of place, but on the other hand, like, it really made that kid seem like a kid. Like, it reminded me of something my eldest son would say to me. Like, right. He speaks to me like that pretty frequently, like kind of a slight sarcastic tone. Sure. And we joke back and forth. So on one hand, it's out of place, but on the other hand, it's like, it gives me a real world kind of touch point of this is a kid. Right. And it's small little like doses of that I think really helps establish this child is a child, right?
Yeah, it definitely sells the character, even though. So I've heard the discussion before, the idea that, well, if we're making a game about, I don't know, King Arthur, then we're not going to have a lot of people of color in the game because it's anachronistic. Like, it doesn't fit with the time. And yet King Arthur's killing dragons, right? So we're like, well, there's this huge fantastical beast that, as far as modern science tells us, never existed. And you're saying you have a problem putting people of color in your game, right? So those arguments never make sense to me. But it was still interesting to have some of these aspects of the writing that didn't necessarily have to be there. And like I said, they weren't game breaking. They didn't throw me off so much, but it was just these little things that I noticed. But it does, like you say, it sells the character. It sells the kid, right? It sells the relationship between the kid and between a son and a father, or a child and a father, right? A child of a certain age even, right? Because this is like a young adolescent boy, maybe getting close to teenage years, right? Somewhere in there is kind of where I place him. So
yeah, I mean, even the fact that the kid speaks with an American accent, right? Like, you could say, well, given the region that they're in, maybe he should speak with, in a different language or with an accent, right?
Right, absolutely. Good point.
Yeah. But I think, again, it comes back to if you make it more true, then is it kind of less relatable or less? And I think I would take that trade-off.
Right. You'd rather the more relatable than the more true.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And like you said, it's it's a made-up world. It's nonfiction.
Fiction.
fiction. It's fiction,
Yeah,
not
yeah, yeah.
it's fictional. So yeah, it's they can kind of make up what they want, right?
Sure. The last, I don't know if you could call it a gripe, but the last, all things considered, I'm fighting the stranger and he like regenerates time and time again. I'm not sure what is supposed to lead me to believe that by breaking this guy's neck that I've actually killed him, because I don't think I've actually killed this guy, and maybe that's part of it. I don't know, because I haven't got any further in this. But to me, the amount of weight to the fight that I saw with the two of them, because that fight was even more like bone breaking, like earth shattering, right, than the fight with this huge troll.
Yeah.
So I know that there's more going on here in this fight, and I know that the stuff that I've put the stranger through in that fight sequence before I broke his neck was already more than just breaking somebody's neck. So that felt like a little anticlimactic for me. But not knowing what's going to happen next, I can't really speak to that, because that's like talking about a sequence at the beginning of a movie and I've still got 2 hours to go before I see how the whole thing plays out.
Sure.
So that was just one of those things where if he was going to get up and throw the rock off that ice, like that huge statue or whatever that I dropped on his head, maybe there was a better way to finish that fight so it felt like I actually killed him, quote unquote. But maybe that's just me.
Yeah, I felt a little differently, because at that point, like, they're both like covered in each other's blood. And I think I remember when I played it, and even watching you play it, I'm like, holy crap, like, these guys are covered like in each other's blood. Like, I don't think it got that graphic, even when you're fighting that huge troll monster thing.
Right.
Like, the degree of, like, the amount of, like, pain they're inflicting on each other, it's like, wow, they're like really going hard on each other. And yeah, seeing them kind of on the ground just covered in each other's blood, I was like, okay, this is like how much further can you go? He snaps his neck and kind of pushes him off the cliff. I also get the sense that probably won't be the last time that we'll see this character. And there is going to be a way of kind of finishing him off for good.
Right.
But yeah, what a great character too. Like, just the motion capture and the animation in the face, and
yeah, I was really impressed with that aspect through the game. But yeah,
yeah, it was very like a superhero fight. Like, it was it was pretty cool. Playing, because when I played, I think I played it on the next level of difficulty. And I think I did die. My only time that I died was at that boss fight. How did you find that as in terms of combat?
Because of the length of the sequence, that's where I noticed most significantly how difficult my using the triggers was versus the face buttons.
Right.
And that's where I found the most challenge of, I'm not quite getting the mechanics, like the control of this character. Because in other sequences, I might do a misstep once, but because of the length of the fight, I didn't notice it all in one chunk. Whereas this one, because the fight just kept going, every time I noticed it, I noticed it in that same fight, if that makes sense. So it was something that I noticed more often. I don't think it was necessarily more difficult, other than the fact that this was a point that I should have brought up earlier, but the way that the HUD is sequenced or is brought to you visually, there's, based on the character that you're fighting, there's this little arrow that kind of circles around your character, because in a third-person view, you can't see behind yourself unless you spin the camera to make that happen. But there's this little arrow that points to your enemy. And when I first saw that much earlier in the game, I thought it was a really simple and yet effective means of communicating that. I didn't need to know that I was getting pounded on. I didn't need to know that I was surrounded or anything. Just that, look, over in this direction, you're looking the wrong way, basically, right? There's nothing blinking on the screen. It's just this little white arrow kind of thing.
Yeah, it's almost like a spidey sense kind of thing where, I even noticed it changes color depending on like how urgent.
That's right.
You need to pay attention. Like white, I think, kind of symbolizes, okay, there's something over there, and then red or yellow kind of signals that, okay, this guy's about to attack. And I think there's even some like subtle animation, whether it kind of vibrates or just subtle cues like that. But yeah, it really helps you kind of get a sense of what's around you.
Right. Yeah, when I first saw that, it was pretty white, which meant in the sequence that I was in when I first noticed it, I didn't feel like I was in any danger. These things were like these lumbering zombie-esque type creatures that after a certain amount of time lumbering, then they'd lunge at you and then they'd back off again. So I never saw the thing go red, that arrow go red, because I always had the time to turn before they would attack me again. But I did notice it a lot more red in the final sequence with this stranger. And that's because he moved way faster than I was expecting based on what I had fought so far, right? Everything else, we start off with these really slow moving creatures, and then there was that ice dude who still wasn't that fast, and there was that troll who was super big and I couldn't lose him if I wanted to, right? Like the broadside of a barn. But this guy moved really quick, and sometimes he would shoot past me and end up behind me. So I need to turn really fast, and that also was another reason why when I'm trying to figure out these controls, that kind of upped the ante, right, in that combat sequence. So I didn't feel like it was over my capacity to do it. And to be fair, I was in easy mode, right, story mode. So I felt it was the right difficulty for what I wanted. So I think at least up to this point in the first hour, that picking the mode that I picked is fair for me. I did mention in the playthrough that there was a number of health things that I just didn't even pick up because there was absolutely no need for it.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that's par for the course for story mode, right?
Yeah.
Because if you're expecting less of a challenge and you still get beaten up, then having a few extra health things lying around is just so that you don't die, right? Because part of wanting the story mode is not wanting to continue on a regular basis. Like, I want to move on with the story. I don't want to restart and do that combat sequence over. So that makes sense.
Yeah. I've been wanting to play more of this game. I just haven't really had the time. Yeah, is there any other kind of thoughts you had?
I guess in the same vein of conveyance, right? The little white arrow conveying that there's a monster behind me or in a direction that I can't see on the screen. The parry mechanism had some conveyance to me as well. When I blocked at a certain time with my shield, the game went slow motion. There wasn't a pop-up on the screen. There wasn't a learning sequence that said, okay, when you do it at this time, then do this. Now let's practice it. Nothing like that. And I really appreciated that a lot of those sequences were just conveyed to me through the game itself, not through a tutorial. There were moments where it was the tutorial that did it, and it was done pretty quick. It didn't break the action too much. But it was interesting to have some of those things conveyed without explaining anything explicitly, and then other things where there's the pop-up on the screen and you're reading text about how this thing works. I prefer the former than the latter. I know that in some games you're less able to do those kinds of things simply because of the complexity, but I feel like to be able to convey that there's a monster behind me without telling me that in a way that doesn't break my immersion of the combat, and being able to convey that I've parried this attack and now I get kind of an attack of opportunity against the creature, without saying anything, just showing that it's slow motion and now the thing's kind of stumbling backwards. I feel like there's some other things that they could have done without putting a text box on the screen. I think that would be plausible.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, that takes more people thinking through the problem and designing over that problem or through that problem, and whether or not a text box is definitely an easier way to go about it.
Well, maybe they play tested some stuff, right?
Sure.
And maybe for whatever reason, it's like, well, the only way people are getting that the kid can shoot arrows is if we kind of stop them before this huge boss fight and say, hey, you can press square to fire off some arrows.
Sure. Yeah, and I don't doubt that a game like this, especially some of these opening sequences, were tested pretty significantly, because of all the things that we've said as little gripes, they're very minuscule and in comparison to the praise we have for the rest of it.
Yeah.
Right? So I'm really pleased with it. I'm interested in the character interactions. I'm interested in the overall narrative arc. The fact that because there's these tropes of father-son and these tropes of like monsters and all these things that we see all pushed together, there's things that I'm expecting out of the narrative and out of the character development just because of the way they built the opening sequence. And that keeps me engaged to find out more, like what's going to happen and who's this and how is this going to affect their relationship and so on and so forth. So I think that's done really well. And I think cinematically, when Detroit was cinematic, A Way Out has been cinematic. I think so far this is the one that I'm the most engaged in.
Right.
Having played all of those relatively the same amount of time, this is the one that to me has grabbed me the most, and feels the most like narrative fiction, right? Like, I would say I've interacted in the other games just as much, but this is the one where I feel most interested in what's coming next.
For sure. All right. Well, I think that'll wrap it up for this episode of Second Player Press Start.
Indeed.
Hope you guys are enjoying these. Let us know if you are or if you're not. Yeah, we'll catch you on another episode when we sit down to do one of these.
Yeah. Any spoilers for upcoming games, James?
I'm not too sure what. There's a couple of games that I haven't even tried yet, and I don't want to just do narrative focused games, which is what we've tackled, but there's a game called Hidden Agenda, which is another kind of, it's almost like a choose your own storyline thing, but the unique thing about that game is the players control it from their phone, and there's like a meta game of kind of making the story go your way versus someone who's sitting next to you. I got that on sale for a few bucks, and the concept seemed really interesting, so
Nice.
I think that'll be a cool one to try. And yeah, I'd like to go back to A Way Out as well, because I think there's definite potential there for that game expanding a bit more. But yeah.
Well,
Good night, Darren.
yeah. Good night, James.